He means not during the talk, after the talk. All right, welcome back, everybody. Please file in, take a seat. Take a seat. We've had some great talks and presentations this morning. We're going to continue that trend with Dan Barker, who I have not had the pleasure of meeting personally, so I'm hoping to get to know him a little better through his presentation. A big round of applause, please, for Dan.
Thank you. I'm Dan Barker. I am the Chief Architect of RSA Archer, which is a Dell Technologies company. And we are just starting off our cultural transformation at this company. I've been a part of these, both successfully and failed at several different companies. But this one we've just started, so we'll be talking a little bit about all the different companies I've been involved in. There's a quote here that's, it's not what we believe, it's what we do that defines our culture. A lot of times I see companies that have their values or their mission statements publicly available, and then you get into the company and you find out that that's not exactly the culture that is acting out those behaviors that were mentioned earlier. Those are different than what is espoused in their belief of what they are. And so that is kind of something I'm going to cover around the behaviors we want to encourage in a just culture. Who here knows what a just culture is? Awesome. So no matter what, you're going to learn something. So it's not on the right screen. Okay. So we'll go through a little bit of background on what just culture is. Sidney Dekker has done a lot of research on this, and John Allspaw, who was the CTO of Etsy at the time, kind of discovered Sidney Dekker and brought him into the DevOps community. And he defines just culture as a culture of trust, learning, and accountability. A lot of times when I'm talking to leaders about just culture, they get a sense that there is no accountability. So we'll cover how accountability is a little bit different inside of a just culture organization. Sidney Dekker divides up a just culture into restorative versus retributive. It should be clear as to which one you want to be. If it's not, we can talk after. So the difference here is in a restorative culture, you're looking at who are hurt, what do they need, and whose obligation is it to meet it. So if there's an incident, you're trying to identify what has gone, who has been impacted by what has gone wrong, and then how can we repair this. In a retributive culture, you're more looking at what rule is broken, how badly was it broken, and what are the consequences going to be for the responsible party. So that's a negative outlook. You see that with a lot of law enforcement type stuff, and there's been a change happening there as well. Then for the accountability, inside of a restorative just culture, accountability is forward-looking. So it's looking more at, as we move forward, who's accountable for providing some of this help, who's accountable for making some changes inside of the system. And in a retributive just culture, it's trying to decide who should pay for what just happened, who's going to take that responsibility and probably get fired or something. And then for the learning and blaming, Sidney Dekker puts a twist on the word account and two definitions of the word account, and says that an account is something you tell and learn from in restorative culture. And in retributive culture, an account is something you settle or pay. So it's a little bit different meaning of the word account, but it helps me understand kind of the difference. So we've seen this basic slide earlier. It is Westrom's culture topology, and the generative aligns pretty well with the restorative just culture, and pathological aligns pretty well with retributive just culture. This is a diagram, or this is a topology of how organizations process information. So it's a little bit different, and I'll call out just a few items. So around messengers, in a pathological organization, messengers are shot. In a bureaucratic organization, messengers are neglected. And in a generative culture, if needed, messengers are trained. And that is you may have seen this in your organizations. I think I agree with Paul to some extent, and I look at pathological organizations as being pretty toxic. And if people are getting not literally shot all the time, then that's probably not an organization you're going to be able to have a lot of effect in, and it's probably going to be fairly damaging. And then there is failure. So in pathological organizations, failure leads to scapegoating. In bureaucratic, failure leads to justice, as is common in governments. And in generative, failure leads to inquiry. And then bridging is discouraged in pathological organizations, tolerated in bureaucratic, and encouraged in generative. And we'll discuss these a little bit further. So I give the Westrum survey to my teams usually. We just did it across all of RSA products. And I did this at a former company, and I was doing it every week because we had just stood up the team. This was a very toxic culture outside of that team. You don't see it evidenced, which is kind of surprising that within a specific team, the culture is quite good. But I needed to be able to measure how my team was being impacted by the external organization. So you can see that we had a spike here in this area around, I believe it was ideas and particularly inquiry. So we mentioned inquiry before, and it started out fairly low, and then it grew there. So it started out low because we didn't have anything to inquire about around failures. We hadn't had an actual failure yet. But right around then is when we had a failure, and so we actually were able to see a spike that we handled that well. And then everything kind of merges into around a 6, and the scale is from 0 to 7. But it's a really easy survey. It's like 6 questions. Yeah, 6 questions, and it takes like 10 seconds for someone to complete. And I did this every week, and now we're doing it about every quarter at RSA. So another aspect is understanding that these human systems are complex. So Dr. Richard Cook wrote a treatise about how complex systems fail. And he talks in there about how these complex systems are intrinsically hazardous systems and that they're always in a state of failure. So all of these systems run in a degraded mode. And all of this research was based in the health industry. But if you go read that paper, you wouldn't know it. It sounds like it was in the technology field. These systems always contain multiple failures at any given time. And catastrophe, a catastrophic failure, a major outage requires multiple failures to occur at the same time. There's an issue here where because there's all of these failures, we still look for a root cause. So there is no root cause in a complex system. So all human systems are complex systems. Some of your technological systems are complex systems. And it's likely that multiple failures went into making that catastrophic failure. And what we do is we apply a hindsight bias when we're trying to find what caused it. And generally, we blame humans for that. You can see some of this with the Boeing 737 MAX that is having issues right now, that's had crashes. And some people are blaming the pilots, and other people are blaming the Boeing for not telling people about a particular system. But there's probably some truth to all of those pieces. But what we know is that in a complex system, all actions are gambles. And the human operators are the tip of the spear there. So they are both producers and defenders against failure. And this is very similar to the 737 MAX. So if they had more information, maybe they could have responded differently and not had a crash. And when they take action, it resolves all the ambiguity that was presently in the system. Humans really are the solution here because they're the adaptable element. So they're the only thing that can really change. All the automation, all of the different systems don't change based off the inputs. Not enough to be able to understand the full complex system. And their expertise is constantly changing. They're constantly creating safety. And that's why it's important to create a good culture to facilitate that learning and that experimentation and that constant growth. So every change you put into the system creates new failure modes, which is why you need that adaptability. That's also why it can be an issue when you try to do root cause analysis and fix what you think is the root cause of the whole problem, and now you may have introduced many more unpleasant ways of failing. So here's a quote from Todd Conklin. So Todd Conklin has a podcast called Pre-Accident Investigations. It's really good. I suggest everyone go and listen to that. Safety is not the absence of accidents. Safety is the presence of defenses. So who here measures their outages based on P1, number of P1s, number of P0s, downtime, all of those things? Yeah, probably everybody. Does anybody know how many defenses they have? No, probably not. So that's a different way of thinking about safety, and it's looking at safety as an attribute of the system rather than something that is part of the human system or part of the outcomes. So another piece, and the last piece kind of the base of this just culture is mindfulness. So Roberts, Wyke, and Sutcliffe identified these 5 components of mindfulness. And the first one is a constant concern about the possibility of failure, even in the most successful endeavors. Deference to expertise regardless of rank or status. So no more, I'm a VP and so you're going to do what I say. This is particularly interesting when you are on an incident, and if you have a good incident management system and you have an incident commander, then the incident commander could tell the CTO or CEO to get off the call or whatever needs to happen. They are the person in charge because they have the most actionable information in the system. An ability to adapt when the unexpected occurs. So that's a commitment to resilience. An ability to both concentrate on a specific task while having a sense of the bigger picture. This is kind of what I call systems thinking. It's good to have an understanding and additional context of the entire system so that individual actors can make better decisions. And generally as a leader, I try to push down information as much as possible so that everyone can make the best decision with the most amount of context. And ability to alter and flatten hierarchy as best fits the situation. So this clearly can't work in a culture that is retributive or pathological. They wouldn't function like this. They wouldn't be able to have the ability to say that someone knows more than them who doesn't rank higher than them. And if you're in those organizations that are really toxic, it's probably easier to get out. And I wouldn't probably try to change a lot. But there are bad cultures that you can still function in and improve. So why would we do this? Why would we want a just culture? So open communication and transparency decreases litigation. Frankel, Leonard, and Denham found that. So I know most organizations prefer secrecy. Most of the companies I've been in, they have said, don't tell the customers this, don't tell the customers that, and be very vague about our future plans. And that is actually not as good as being open. And I've personally, looking at vendors, I've preferred the people who are very open with me about the areas where they may or may not fail. The aviation safety record is incredible, and they've been doing this for over 30 years. So this is a good example of where just culture has been very successful across an entire industry. And you can also improve outcomes as a byproduct. So what Todd Conklin found was that failures that cause accidents rarely cause fatalities. And I think a lot of the times what we monitor isn't necessarily what causes an outage or a major outage. So we monitor, like the first things you monitor are CPU and memory. But I rarely find that those are the things that cause my major outage that goes for several days. Those are usually the things that cause a small blip on a particular host. And a lot of times it's Java and I restart it. And then everything's fine for another week. And then you can also potentially increase output. So Todd Conklin has written about this. There has been some start of research around mining where they found that areas that, or mines that had fewer accidents actually produced more. And so there is a business impact to being able to have fewer outages, which I'm sure if you're around during an outage, a lot of work isn't getting done by a lot of people. You can't deploy, most of your ops people are busy, most of your senior developer type people are busy, so it slows down work substantially. And you can also get happier team members. And happy people make better software. There's research on that, I swear. So Arthur Ashe, and this is similar to Paul's quote earlier, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. A lot of times when I'm talking about these things, people say I'm not a leader, I can't really do anything, and I don't believe that's accurate. There's always something you can do. I started off as a software engineer not long ago, and I was able to influence change in a very large organization. It was localized to my area, but then when I went to the next company, I made a point of trying to determine, was leadership ready for this, or was leadership not bought in? And that's really important for me when I'm looking at a company, is to know, is the leadership ready for a change? So areas I think that everyone can help out in is inquiry into failure, information transparency, cross-functional collaboration, and the sharing of responsibilities. So anyone can organize a blameless postmortem. I've done it as just a regular individual contributor, nobody special. A lot of times the other operators and engineers will find this interesting. They like to learn. They like to do their jobs better. So if you can get one informally created, then perfect. If you can get it formally set up as a process, then that's even better. Who here knows what a blameless postmortem is? Oh, great. So that's kind of walking through a timeline. You're trying to have just the facts, and then your goal is to learn from that. And part of that is changing your language of how you talk about what happened. So a lot of times people say, I should have done this, I should have done that. And what we want to change is, I did X and I expected Y, but I saw Z. So that makes it very factual. This is what happened, this is what I was expecting to have happen, and then this is what actually happened. We also don't want to try to predict the future, like, next time I'll do this, because we don't actually know what will happen. We can only hypothesize what would happen in the future. The goal of all of this is just to learn what actually happened, and hopefully we won't make the same mistakes again. And hopefully during this process of this blameless postmortem, we will find areas to improve, but that's not the goal. The goal is not to come out with a checklist. And I'm really happy at RSA because we have set out to do this, and the leadership actually doesn't want a checklist of items that we can go complete at the end of the blameless postmortems. And our leadership team will now be doing these for larger failed feature releases. So not just an incident in the IT area, but also a failure in our ability to execute on the business values. So when we create a new feature, we should, if that feature never gets used, we should now do a postmortem. And so the goal is to focus on what you'll do next in a postmortem. And you also need to introduce more feedback into your system. So when you're doing these postmortems or you're doing some sort of post-accident investigation, the more information you can have, the better, and the more effective you'll be at making decisions moving forward. So if that's monitoring, then that's great. I also showed you I do the Western survey. So if you can get that kind of information in there, that's helpful for the cultural aspects. And for information transparency, I think email is why is my mouse over there? I think email is a horrible venue for information. It locks it away to just a few people generally. It gets lost. Everybody has limits, except for maybe Microsoft. I don't know. So I've always had limits, some shockingly low, and so I end up losing tons of information. So if you can get this into wikis or Git or Slack, then that's great. I actually think that the biggest value is getting it to where the right people can find it. So when I was at a previous company called DST, we actually put everything in Git and then delivered it to like 4 different places just through automation. So every time we updated it, it went and updated a wiki, it updated a security product, it updated a file share, and it uploaded it to somewhere else. I don't remember where now. But so it published it to multiple different places for different audiences. I think a lot of people think that, hey, if I just post it to this thing where no one can search for it, that's transparency. But it's still hidden. People can't find that information. So I also like the idea of open meetings. This doesn't mean everyone joins and gets to talk throughout the meeting. That would be very unproductive. But you can have a scribe come in. So it's great to have an individual contributor come in and help scribe for the meeting and take notes, and then provide those notes to the rest of the organization. That shows that you're not, as a leadership team, you're not trying to hide anything. And most of the companies I've been in have been shockingly open to this. I just had to ask, and then they let me do it. So they obviously wanted to edit to some extent, but they didn't want to limit my ability to learn what was going on. And you also need to finalize decisions asynchronously. So if you're ever part of making decisions, try to post those somewhere before finalizing that decision. I find a lot of people get into meetings, discuss what's going to be decided. Everyone decides, yes, we're going to go forward with this, and then 2 weeks later, you're like, why are you working on that? That's not what we decided. I'm like, yeah, we said that 10 minutes into the phone call. I thought that's what we were agreeing to. And so everyone's agreeing to something different. So I like to document it clearly. Usually we put it on Slack, and then we give everyone a couple of days to decide whether or not they actually agree with the written down proposal. And use Slack or Teams, throwing a bone to Microsoft. I've mostly used Slack, but it's a great way to provide information to everyone very quickly. It's also great to have the channels because I'll get pulled into something and I can go back for the last 2 days and read all of the context that's there. I don't read most of the channels most of the time, but when I need to read it, it's good that all the information's there. And it's also good to teach others. So how complex systems fail, which I covered earlier, the Western model and just culture from Sidney Dekker, are great things to teach people. I find that how complex systems fail really resonates with most developers, especially people developing on distributed systems. And the other two are really good with leadership. So for cross-functional collaboration, you should invite other functions to your stand-ups, to your design sessions. So if you're on the development side, then have ops included during these processes. And you can do that as an individual contributor. Just ask if you can invite some ops people. They're usually more than happy to come then rather than at 2 a.m. When they're responding to an incident that they could have probably solved. We've found huge improvements in our system and our understanding. Our developers at one organization didn't really know how certs worked, or not the real way certs worked. And so we were able to avoid a lot of issues and automate a lot of that very quickly when the ops people were involved in that process. You can also do a hackathon. So we've done hackathons at every company I've been at. And the ones that are the most valuable for this are the ones that reward extra points for including someone from another function. And those, you often get the best results from those as well. You get the most innovative ideas and the best execution. So there's something called Mixer that John Allspaw, who I mentioned earlier, introduced at Etsy. So Mixer is still, I guess, a tool that is written in PHP. It uses your Active Directory system to match up two people every couple of weeks. So the last company I was at was the first place I was ever actually able to introduce this. And it was really, really successful. So what we used was Slack and this app that was free called Donut. You just install it into a channel, and then every 2 weeks, you meet with the other person. At the last company, we were all co-located, so it was really easy to meet up and go have coffee or something. And you talk about generally non-work stuff. And then you go back to the Mixer channel and you update it with kind of what you learned about that person. Right now, we're introducing this, and this came from our VP of product, said that he wanted to do this. And so the leadership team is involved in this, and they meet with everybody every 2 weeks. I just met with someone who's been working at RSA for 2 years, and we met on Zoom because he's in India. So we're a distributed company, so we're trying to bridge that gap of being a distributed company so that we can bring India and multiple locations in the US together as one culture. Because as you probably know, you find that the culture diverges very quickly as you have multiple areas where your organization operates. You should also make goals cross-functional. So when I was an engineer working at my first company, straight out of college, I went and looked up, all of our goals were public there. And so I went and looked up people's goals, and I found ways to make my project align to their goals. So that they would do work for me, so that their goals would be achieved, and my goals would be achieved, and we would have a nice symbiotic relationship. It was very effective, and it is something that I try to do as often as possible. It's better to get ahead of that, so starting several months out in the goal planning process to be able to get your goals aligned well is good. And it was just interacting with other individual contributors or their managers to make sure that we could all achieve our goals together. And we also have created a dev and ops rotation. So to gain that empathy that Paul was talking about earlier, we cycle developers into the operations areas and operations into the developer areas. This is a little bit harder to do on your own, unless you can get some time from your manager to go and sit with some ops people. But this is really effective because developers usually do not know what operations people do, or that they wake up at night and that they're constantly having pagers and that they sit on 5-6 hour long phone calls where almost nothing gets said while people are just running commands. And the ops people don't generally know what work goes into doing development and what is possible. And so when they start seeing what each other can do, you get a lot better systems being created out of that. So we can also share responsibilities. So we can make our team goals rather than individual. So that's kind of getting ahead of the game and setting up a team-oriented goal. OKRs were mentioned. We're trying to do that at RSA as well. It's a challenge to get, because you have to actually have focus, which is incredibly hard for companies with lots of things to do. And you have to have very few goals every year. So if you have 10 goals, you're probably not going to achieve any one of those. You really need like 3 goals. And those have to be owned by the entire team. You can also volunteer to help others, which Paul said earlier, and I have done effectively as well. So being able to either dedicate yourself or some part of the team to another team to help out is really valuable. So we had, at a previous company, we were deploying Hadoop clusters, multi-100 node Hadoop clusters several times a month, and it was starting to weigh us down. And we actually first put a senior level architect, software architect on it, and a senior level systems architect. And that was really costly because those people are not cheap. They were on it for 2 weeks, and they were not always done at the end of the 2 weeks. And the system did not always function well. So we decided that we would, and it was kind of a ground up, the ops side and the dev side that were working on these Hadoop clusters said, hey, let's get together, let's use Chef and all these other things that we've been using, and let's deploy these automatically. So our managers agreed to it. We combined for 3 months, and we got our deploy times down to just 2 to 4 hours. And it was idempotent, so we just kept running them until all of the nodes were finally up and running successfully. We had tests run, and now we really didn't, we just required a regular systems engineer to run these and deploy them, which gave us a lot of advantage in the market because now we didn't have to have several month lead time to get their new clusters deployed as we onboarded hospitals. So when failure occurs, don't blame. Obviously, blaming is inherently not sharing the responsibilities. So if you can't blame someone else if it's also your responsibility. I think that's clear. So blame is a critical piece to not have in a just culture. This goes back to the item that Paul mentioned about the way we often look at our own behaviors and the behaviors of others. So always try to have empathy for why someone may have made a choice or acted in a certain way. Assume that everyone is acting in the best interest of the company and what the knowledge that they have at the time. So the best thing you can do is provide more knowledge. So no matter where you are in the organization, you play a part in the culture. You will influence the culture in some way, and you are leading someone at all times. If you're, maybe if you're a brand new dev, maybe you're not leading someone then, but if you've been there 6 months and someone just starts, you're probably leading them in some way. There's probably something that other people don't. So always, realize that you are a leader, whether you think you are or not, and whether you are formally or not. And you have a responsibility to influence this culture. And we really can only influence the culture because it's a complex system, and so we can't purposely make a change that we will know the outcome of. But we can certainly influence in the right direction. Also, be patient. So people will frustrate you. You will say the same thing over and over again in meetings for months, and then someone will finally get it, and they'll be like, hey, this is amazing. I understand. I finally understand what happened, or what this DevOps thing is, or what just culture is. And that's really awesome that they finally get it, and it's great. However, sometimes they come to you and say that, and someone at a previous company said, I finally get this agile thing. It's just waterfall with shorter cycles. Yeah. That's depressing. Because now they think they've had an epiphany and you have to change it. So that's like 6 months of meetings saying the same thing over and over again. But be patient because, that person, all they knew was waterfall. And so everything they learned, they tried to put in the context of waterfall. And you're going to have to fight those biases. In like how complex systems fail, Richard Cook talks about how these systems that are performing well are heavily defended against failure. And part of that failure is change. Systems do not want to change. So if you're introducing some sort of cultural change or some new knowledge, they're going to try to revert to the old knowledge. And they're going to try to find parallels with that knowledge and bring everything back to that bedrock of knowledge that they have and that they've likely been doing for 20, 30 years. Also, don't let the culture hurt you. So I've been in very toxic cultures and I have left those. They are very damaging. They can hurt you very quickly. If you're in a really toxic culture, you should leave. It is not worth it, and you will not change it. And the more toxic the culture, the more violent the expulsion. So when the system finally shoves you out, it's going to hurt a lot more. The more toxic that culture is. So please be good to yourself and leave those organizations. But there are bad cultures that you can survive in. So just hopefully you'll be able to understand the difference. And I can tell you some stories too if you want to know real toxic cultures. And here's a few references. I'll post these slides, or maybe the conference will as well. And that's it.
Well, thank you so much for that. That was very, very good. And I definitely want to share some toxic culture war stories with you, perhaps over beverages this evening, because that's always the best time. Do we have time for some questions? Indeed, we do have time for some questions. Does anybody have any questions for Dan? Yeah, Chris, you got some questions. All right, I'll come over there.
I have a question about dev and ops rotation. So usually developers don't have enough knowledge about operation stuff. So how do we manage such situations?
That's a good question. So usually we pair them up with an operations person, so they're not going to go in there and just do the job. I prefer to have the developer be the person with hands on keyboard and have the operations person being over the shoulder, kind of telling them what to do. I think that gives them the most impactful experience. There are other, you can have the operator be there and then the developer sitting in the back kind of watching. I find that they often just watch their phone and it's not quite as effective. So getting them involved and having them do that, but having an operations person there definitely, because usually they don't have access to the systems and they can't run a lot of the tools. And the same with ops when they come over. What we usually try to do is have them sit and do the coding and have the devs kind of walk them through it.
Any other questions? There was another hand up over here previously. Yeah, great.
Thank you for the talk. What do you think about OKRs and how this thing is related to culture?
Yeah, everything's easy to screw up. So OKRs can be good and OKRs can be bad. So I prefer OKRs that are bottom up rather than OKRs that are top down. OKRs are just a tool. I find them to be useful when they're bottom up. That's when I get to influence and kind of try to help other people align themselves to my goals, or at least we can all kind of agree that these are the set of goals that we want to achieve. I find when they get pushed down, a lot of times you just end up with more goals than you should have, because people at the top are identifying, hey, we want all of these things, and then you're trying to figure out how do I fulfill all of these requests, rather than saying, hey, this is what we can produce in this time frame.
All right, excellent. We have time for another question.
I think I have a quick question about this mixer stuff that you said. What was the intention of it? Just make people talk to each other so everyone could talk to all other people in a team, or what?
For what?
This mixer,
Mixer.
on Slack.
Yeah, so Mixer, and it's an app called Donut, so you can check it out and put it onto a channel in Slack. It's free for that piece at least. But so what it does is everyone who joins that channel can get paired up every 2 weeks. And the goal of that is so that people can start to meet people that they wouldn't have met. There's actually an algorithm in Donut that tries to prioritize people that don't normally talk on Slack together, so that they meet up more often. So there's a lot of value for me and for other leadership members that we can interact with everyone in the company more regularly and get real one-on-one time to learn more about the actual individuals. And a lot of that is around that personal relationship growth, so that we have better relationships. I think GitLab is a great example of a company that does that and tries to prioritize those types of interactions. So if you can go read some information about what they do, they have a lot of good tools for managing a distributed system of people. And I treat an organization that has disparate people throughout geographies as a remote company first. And so we try to prioritize joining by video and everybody joining by conference call rather than some people being in a conference room and some people being, on a phone waiting to say something through the entire meeting. So we try to make sure that we're remote first. And this is one of those methods of trying to join that culture across all geos.
So we use Donut at Datadog, and I can tell you the algorithm of it pairing you with people you don't normally speak with is bang on. It's been pairing me with salespeople for a year. So, another question.
How many times have you actually seen a CEO on the incident call? And I'm asking this because they do have a role on these incident calls. So the best thing that they can do is that, sit quiet, and then when we do the stuff and we might have questions like, what part of the application should I bring up first? Like, for which customer should I, prefer to restore the first? So I think this is really a good role for them on such calls.
And so it depends on the size of the company and the role of the CEO, CTO, whatever VP level they are. So I've seen them on the calls several times. These are larger organizations where things have gotten escalated fairly high, especially on multi-day outages. They tend to be involved in those. So the incident commander has a responsibility to manage that, those individuals, those higher profile individuals, to make sure they're fulfilling the role that is needed by the incident response team or tell them to leave. And I think there was a story from Chef once that the CTO or CEO, I don't remember who it was told to leave on an incident because he was trying to offer advice on how to fix the thing. But it wasn't really useful at the time because people were handling it. The people with the most knowledge were already solving the problem. So it's more about the role that you're playing in the incident rather than the title that you have. What I've found is that in large organizations, the CEO has no role in an incident response. We have a separate call usually for customers and customer management, and that's kind of the CEO's role. And when they get onto the call, they're usually complaining that it's not ready, and they're asking for timelines and things that are not actually solving the problem.
All right, thank you very much. Let's have another round of applause, please, for Dan.
Thank you.
Brilliant presentation. Thank you so much.